All right, so as you continue to come streaming in, I'm just going to start by introducing myself. I am Suzanne Teller. I'm the outreach coordinator for the Lucky Mute Watershed Council, and really happy to be here today and welcome all of you. Also with us here tonight, very honored and very happy to welcome our speaker for the evening, David Lewis. And I'll introduce him more formally in a little bit. And also with us here is Kendra Callahan, Outreach Assistant for the Lucky Mute Watershed Council. She will be moderating the question and answer portion of tonight's webinar. And not here on the panel that you're seeing, but over at Brew Coffee and Tap House in Independence is a watch party going on with about 30 folks there watching us, and managing that scenario over there is Kristen Larson, Executive Director of the Lucky Mute Watershed Council, and Maya Cook, Operations Coordinator. So thank you both, and thank you all for attending tonight. Before I introduce David and turn it over to him, I'd like to spend just a couple of minutes telling you about our Sips of Science series and orient you to the format of tonight's presentation. For those of you joining us who aren't familiar with the Lucky Mute Watershed Council, we are a community-based nonprofit based in Independence, Oregon. We work alongside many different partners, including cities, schools, local businesses, other nonprofits, different agencies, including tribal agencies and other government entities, and of course our local landowners, and we all work to protect and restore the lands and rivers of the Lucky Mute and Ash Creek watersheds. We are also working to restore relationships between and among people and the land, the rivers, and their watershed communities. And this we do through our education and outreach program, which we call the Love Your Watershed program. Our Sips and Science talks are part of this effort, and I'm really thrilled that you're all able to join us tonight. Our Sips and Science talks and other Love Your Watershed events would not be possible without the support of our friends of the LWC, our business circle members, and all of our donors and our many dedicated volunteers. And I'd like to thank, tonight, I'd like to thank specifically the Willamette Habitat Restoration Fund for providing funding for this event, and for several other events this year that focused on the history and the ongoing contributions of the first peoples of this land, the Kalapuya. Before I turn it over to David, I'm going to also orient you to the format of this webinar. You'll see on the lower part of your screen both a chat button and a Q&A button. Please use the Q&A button for all questions you have for David and about his presentation. Kendra, as I said, will be moderating that throughout the presentation. You can enter those questions at any time you think of them. Please do so, and so you don't forget, and they don't all come at once at the end. We will be saving all those questions for the end of the presentation, but you can enter them anytime. You can also upvote if you see a question there that you also wanted to ask, or someone beat you to it. You can put ahead a little upvote tick mark there, and that will raise that question to the top. So Kendra will be able to see that earlier and faster. We are a big group tonight. So far, we have 91 joining us through Zoom and another additional 30 over at Brew. So I hope that we get through all the questions, but there is a chance that we may not. And so just I wanted to let you know that in advance. And if you have any technical issues, any questions you have for me, like problems with the format or the logging in or however technical issues you might have, please use the chat button for that. I will be monitoring the chat and hopefully being able to help work through that with you. So please note also that this presentation is being recorded, and it will be available in the next day or two to view and share, both on our website and our YouTube channel. Kendra, maybe you can pop in I can't type and talk at the same time, so if you could pop in our website address for the council, that would be fantastic in the chat. You'll also receive an email letting you know when that recording is available. All of you, since you've registered, you will do that. Okay, so Now I think it is high time that I turn it over to David. By way of introduction here, briefly, David is an assistant professor of anthropology and ethnic studies at Oregon State University, and he's a member of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. I want to say he's also the author and ethnographer behind the most in-depth and comprehensive online resource for Oregon Indigenous history, culture, and knowledge that I've ever seen, and which I'm sure he'll be pointing you toward this evening at some point. So with that, David, the floor is yours. All of you. I'll let you share your screen.
Great.
Okay. There we go.
Let's see, I think that's the right one. Hi, everybody. It's good to be here. Lots going on in my world. I don't know about yours, but now I'm closing about 1 million windows because I don't need them really open right now. But let me get this presentation started. Make sure we have it right. Can you guys see that? Single screen. Okay, good. Did it the right direction. Good. So great to be here. Unfortunately, I can't see all of you. So if you're happy or sad, I can't really see that. If you're angry, I can't see that either. So you might as well not even be angry or even happy or sad. So, and I wish I was there drinking beer with you or cider, whatever it is. That might have been fun as well. So anyway, so yeah, I like doing these presentations, and I generally update them every month or so and add new materials. And so there's new stuff in here, stuff I've just kind of fallen upon or happened upon this last year. Some of my new research, and hopefully you'll enjoy it for those of you who've seen it before. If not, I'm sorry, but this is what I have. So let's move forward from here. Let's see. All right, first off, introduce the Lower Columbia. So this is kind of a area somewhat outside of where we normally talk about in terms of Kalapuya, but they do have a bearing because all these different nations are mainly Chinookan nations here, up the Columbia, up the coast of Washington, somewhat on the coast of Oregon, all the way down to the Deschutes area where the dogleg is on the far right. So these areas were different nations of Chinookan peoples. They're all part of what we call the Columbia River Trade Network of perhaps thousands of tribes that added their products and to this whole trade network. And the Kalapuyans were a part of that as well. They came, down up and down the Willamette, and then traded with all of the Chinookan peoples in this area. So they're a part of, they added their own products, specialized products to that market, and then would collect things or trade for things they wanted from the Columbia River. And here's the Kalapuya area, mainly the Willamette Valley and the Umpqua Valley. And so there was a number of tribes in this area, mostly Kalapuya people from the Tualatin in the north all the way down to the Uncall in the south. Your area is the Lucky Mute people. And there also were Clackamas, Molalla, and a couple of Molalla bands in the valley as well. And so these are all different peoples that utilize resources throughout the area. And these lines on this map are not defined borders. These are just averages or estimates of where their lands were. So it seems to me that the Kalapuyans were very much welcoming to outsiders coming in onto their lands, and would accept people coming in and trading, and were not really uppity, not really protective of their valleys, their prairies so much, but may have been somewhat protective of their villages and maybe their primary crop areas like Camas areas and some acorn areas, or maybe Wapato Lake may have been, well protected, well defended. But because they didn't have much fishing in the valley, there wasn't much other resources to protect. So The Lucky Mead area is kind of an odd area. It's in between some major valleys like the Yamhill Valley area and the Marys River area. So it's kind of an odd area. The tribes were somewhat smaller than other Kalapuya tribes, and they were probably related pretty closely to the Yamhill and maybe the Santiam peoples, because the Santiam were right across the river from them, and the Yamhill were just north of them, and then the Marysville just south of them. So that's kind of the way it's all laid out. We'll talk more about them obviously in a few minutes. Oh, I didn't. My other map is gone from this. That's weird. Anyway, there was a map further on south showing the tribes in the further south, but I'll just move on. So Kalapuya, our oral history is pretty interesting. A lot of folks now archaeologically place the Kalapuya as around 9,500 years, because the oldest sites are found down on the Long Tom area, and yet we have these oral histories in the Kalapuya texts, and this is part of what they call the 4 ages of the world story. And this one talks about them having to climb up or run up or escape up a big mountain away from a giant flood. And so the flood is massive enough that it appears to be what looks like a Missoula flood. And so that's what I'm assuming when I read this. It's just too big to be anything else. I don't know of any other floodwaters that get to the tops of mountains like it suggests. And so they're attempting to make some reasoning behind it, or why it came in and why it receded. But really, it's just an eyewitness account of, probably from several people, of escaping and surviving through the flood, and there's more account here of animals and such that survived. So that's pretty interesting to me, and that means that the tale could be upwards of 18,000 years old, which pushes the Kalapuya time frame really far back. A lot, and right now we're kind of looking at these stories as history. For the longest time, tribal oral histories were kind of not respected. They were thought to be more like Greek and Roman mythology, not respected mainly because they're not Christian mythology, but they're thought to be too fantastic to be real. So they were not thought to have any kind of value to Western society at all. And so in the last 30 years or 40 years now, there's been a change in that attitude, where people are starting to confirm that some of the details here in these stories are likely true events that happened in the history of Oregon. Geologic events, volcanic events, water events, tsunamis have been confirmed on the coast, for oral histories on the coast. And so there's lots of folks now look at these stories as actually history about something that happened in the past, and perhaps these are eyewitness accounts of seeing history happen around them. And people may be asking, so how come we don't see that in the archaeology? Well, I think we could, if we were to get to below the Missoula flood layer, the soil layers. Missoula soils are, I've heard, there's some 90 feet in some areas of the valley. I think that's up near Portland area. There's some 90 feet of flood soils. And so when we think about it, all the older archaeological sites for the tribes is going to be underneath all of those Missoula flood soils. And there's not a lot of archaeological digs that are going below a few meters. So I think that if we were going to look for older evidence of the tribes, we would have to get below those flood soils somehow to find that. And the reason why they find 9,500 year sites in the Southern Valley is because the Long Tom area has much more thinner soils, because the floodwaters didn't reach there as much as got to the Central and Upper Willamette area. So anyway, so that's my own reasoning for whatever it's worth, and I just wanted to offer that perspective of how long we have been here. We're not a recent people, we're an older people, we're the older tribes in the area. In fact, I was reading just the other day, some scholars have, since the early 20th century, thought that the Kalapuya and and Takelma are actually related languages or dialects of one another. So probably on the same tree. So I'm interested in reading more about that, but that means that Takelma and Kalapuya languages are probably the oldest languages in Oregon, if not the oldest, one of the oldest. Here's a Kalapuya calendar. This was copied down by Alfred Gatchett back in 1877 from the Grand Ronde Reservation. He was talking to Tualatin people. And there are actually two Kalapuya calendars, but this is the best one, I think, because it kind of lays out the year in terms of like a harvest cycle of different plants, mainly Camas and Wapato. And this shows like two different periods where you can actually dig Camas. One is in early or late, actually late winter, and the other one is in the middle of the summer. So that, and then there's basically in the falls when you collect, or at this time of the year, it'd be when you collect Wapato from various sources, and this is talking about Wapato Lake, like Gaston Lake, they call it. So what does this mean? Well, I mean, there's only one hint on here of hunting. There's no fishing noted. So, you know, Kalapuyans were a different tribe, different culture than you see for Chinookans that had lots and lots of fish, because they had big waters, the Columbia, and so the Kalapuyans were really kind of more centered around the plants, you know, the plant cycle, the harvest cycle of different plant species that would be ripe at certain times of the year. And so they could apparently dig Camas at least twice a year on this calendar. And there is actually another story from the Tualatin of people perhaps cooking Camas in the fall as well, in the same pits as you would cook and prepare the acorn seeds. And so that's the same time as the acorn harvest, which is about this time as well. So that suggests at least 3 times of the year that they would dig and cook Camas and prepare it for the wintertime. And so Camas was a pretty common food, very, very common, common winter food. Wapato was a very common food too in the valley, as we'll talk about in a little bit. And then other ones would be sort of acorns and other root plants, huckleberries, you know, other wild berries, and then meats and stuff like that. So, but not so much fish. Fish was here. There are records of hunting and fishing quite a bit, but they don't have the fishing falls and fishing rapids like they have on the Columbia, where you can catch scads of fish all at one time, dry it out, and preserve it. And so we had lots and lots of Wapato, lots and lots of Camas, and so that is our product. You know, that's our specialized product in the valley. And they would take the extras of those preparations up to places like Willamette Falls or the Cascades, and they would trade for dried fish, dried salmon, you know, whatever they had coming in on the trade networks there. So here's kind of what that cycle may look like, kind of a graphic of what we call in anthropology a seasonal round, the annual cycle where the tribes would move around the land to different places where different products were available and harvest them in whatever method they had. And then normally these camps were places not just for hunting or fishing or gathering, they would also be preparing the foods for winter storage or for trade or whatever it is. And so they would do this because it's actually easier to carry out the finished product stored up in bags and baskets and things like that, rather than taking the raw product out of the ground and take it all with you. And so obviously once you dry out meat, dry out berries, dry out Camas and Wapato, it weighs less. And so this is a method of carrying lots of food at one time, lots of product home and for storage, and or to market for trade. generally Camas is talked about in some stories as being packed. The cooked Camas would either be dried out or would be packed in these things we call Camas wheels, which are probably like these just round or ovoid packages of cooked Camas that are all smashed together. And then those are taken to a village and are traded for similar packets of dried salmon. And the salmon would be dried out and then it would be ground into a powder. So that could be mixed into other foods. And the same thing with Camas. If Camas is dried out, it could also be mixed into other foods, rehydrated, and become part of a soup or a stew or some sort of mixture. So that's what people did. And generally these camps are also not single resource camps. That people were obviously there for a specific reason, for Camas or for sturgeon or for Wapato or whatever it is. But everybody in camp had specific purposes. Some people did preparation, some people did hunting, some people did fishing, some people would gather weeding materials at the same time as they are gathering these products, the weed materials that were ready for harvest. And so that's what people did. People specialized in what they did, and everybody in the family had their jobs. So just wanted to mention that. The winter villages were places where people would stay in, sometimes for months and months and months inside and not go outside, because mainly it's very cold. And if you've read anything about the Kalapuyans, they tended to walk around naked a lot, even in the wintertime. For whatever reason, they must have had like really good fat on their body, because it would have been really cold for me, at least, walking around naked around Oregon in the wintertime. Even today, and it's actually warmer today than it ever has been. So it's very strange. They did have a kind of winter clothing they would make out of like rabbit fur. They turned inside out, so the fur was on the inside. There is hints that was made for winter use, but mostly people would stay inside, warm inside their longhouses, and eat the food they had stored there for as long as they could. And then in the fall, in the late winter, they would be starving. They would go out and dig the first Camas before it even erupted into flower. And they may take some of that or some other products they've been making, like basketry over the wintertime, up to Willamette Falls and trade for Ooligan smelt or sturgeon or Wapato or whatever they can get. So these are kind of the way things worked for the tribe. So you can kind of see that the camps and different methods and different things they would get throughout the year in this little graphic.
David, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I think you wanted most questions for the end, but I just had a very simple question that someone sent through, and that was to just explain what a Wapato is.
Well, I've actually have a slide right after that shows pictures of some Wapato. This is kind of a Wapato. It's a very large Wapato. If our Wapatos are much smaller, I should get a better picture of a small Wapato in here. But Wapato is arrowroot, arrowleaf plant, they call them. There's lots of different kinds around the world. They're very much like or equated with the potatoes sometimes. Settlers actually called them Indian potatoes because before there was potatoes in Oregon, they had to eat the native plants, the settlers who came here. So they would substitute them for a while for potatoes, but really the Wapato is this really nutritious, starchy plant. You can cook up like a potato in the oven or in a kind of a warm oven situation and eat it like a potato, and it doesn't have a lot of flavor, but they were well liked by a lot of tribes. And so here's your Wapato. They grow, and I'll show you more pictures, but they grow pretty much in these sort of wetland, watery areas normally. Here's your acorns, and we have Camas here. So these are one of the three major crops that the Kalapuyans would access throughout the year. We are in this, what they call the acorn belt that goes all the way down from Southern California all the way up into Washington on the inland prairies and valleys. There's quite a bit of acorns all through the Coast Range, all the way down, into your interior valleys, and all the tribes had them as, or used them as food. So camas, I don't know if you've seen them fields in the area. You probably have lots of camas fields in the area that erupt around May, and they last several months, and then they dry out to seed, and people would then harvest them after they dry out to seed. So camas are very nutritious, but don't try to eat one raw, because they will give you major gas. So just saying, unless you like major gas, and then that's something, it's up to you. But if you want to read what their effects, read through the Lewis and Clark journals, because it laid them up for several days. That must have been a sight. So here's an oral history of Kalapuya use of antip or camas. Antip is the Kalapuya word for camas, and the way the words work and the nouns work in Kalapuyan is there's always an an or am in front of the word, means the, and the actual word is tip. So antip is camas, is the camas. So long ago, it says people would dig a hole. This is the fall story for acorns, and they would build a fire inside of the hole. Now they would put a lot of stones on top of the fire. Then when the rocks get hot, they would say to the shaman, "Go look at the rocks now. All right for us to put our camas on them." Now then the shaman would step barefooted on the hot rocks. He would cross over on them. He would look at his feet, and he would say, "Oh, pretty soon the camas will be good, well cooked." And then they placed all their camas there. They always put large quantities of maple and ash leaves. They put them in first, and then they put the camas and they cover it with earth. So they're creating this like underground, it's actually an underground pit that has layers of camas, along with like maple leaves, and other kind of like skunk cabbage leaves and stuff like that. And they let that sort of steam inside the ground for upwards of 4 days. And that cooks the camas in like the slow cook situation, slow steaming situation for until it transforms into a starch that's more palatable for humans. And apparently and I haven't had a lot of them, but they are somewhat sweet when they come out. They're kind of a delicacy. They look kind of a brown fawny color when they're ready, and that's because the starches have become better sugars for human appetite. Otherwise, you did like I said, you'll have major gas. So camas ovens are found all over the Willamette Valley, and they go back as long as 7,000 years ago. And so we don't know, but it's possible that this method of cooking camas developed some 8,000 years ago and spread around the valley. And so people then learned to cook camas in vast quantities very quickly in these underground ovens at that point. There are some that are pretty well organized too. They actually made, normally a lot of ovens right now are made to be like one-time use. They're just dug for that day or that couple days. Back in the day, they apparently would line these holes with rocks and make their own sort of like insert oven that you could actually reuse over and over again. And then that oven later on became a storage pit as well. And so people would pack their camas into the storage pit, wrap them in leaves, and leave them perhaps as a storage over the wintertime for use later on. And those have actually been found. There's been a number of ovens that have been found like that are co-used as storage pits. So camas flour is a very early crop, one of the earliest crops in the area. It usually takes over fields, and it's really the most dominant flour in the fields in this area, at least. And I think that there was so much camas in this valley, it seems like the valley was made for it, that the valleys are kind of commonly held areas for most of the tribes. This summer I engaged in a little bit of research because I've been going out to Minto Brown Park to do a little bit of research, to see these Camas fields out there for over the past perhaps 10 years. I have pictures to prove it if you want to see those. It may take a while to see all my pictures, but these are just from the summer, and this is a little a Juncus patch in this field called farm field in the middle of Brown Park, and you see the little Camas in front here, but there's actually Camas all around it on both sides. And I show this because and this is another direction, and we see there's like a little nice little path through here. I ride or walk through occasionally. And then this was early May this year. You can see it's the grass are just coming up. I think they mowed sometime in perhaps February or April or something, but to keep it down. But the grass are just coming up. And then a week later, we see there's a bunch of rain, and all of a sudden there's a lake or a pond in the middle of this field. And it kind of reminded me about some stuff I've been reading about, which we'll talk about in a minute, of older stories, older experiences in Oregon from 1840s, of there being these low-lying sort of swales and ponds all throughout the valley, because Oregon has had a lot of rainfall, Western Oregon especially, and so this was then a common sight everywhere you went following a rainstorm. It would be flooded like this up as much as a foot or two, and then within a few days it would dissipate. And we see like this is literally the next week, and that water has dissipated. And the Juncus is fine. Camas is still here. Nothing is really disturbed that much. I guess they've been watered really well, but there's not much. I mean, so this is a common cycle for this valley, a cycle that has been interrupted by humans now for the last 150 odd years. And here's some of those Camas plants, really kind of healthy in the field. The earliest Camas that erupt are the common Camas, which are a little smaller clearly than the giant Camas. Giant Camas starts erupting in May, like we see here. Common Camas has already been up and already almost going to seed at this point in May, but these are the giant Camas coming up. You can see they have not just one, not two, not three, but about 7 or 8 different layers of flowers, and they start blooming from the bottom up. And each bloom takes about a week to exhaust itself till they're fertilized, and then they keep on going up. So these plants last almost 2 months because of how big they are. And I see a lot of them in pairs. I call them sister plants. And it's pretty interesting watching them erupt and going back and visiting them every other day to see how they're doing, and to realize that they keep on growing higher and higher and higher, and because they're so big. Here's some details of that flower bud as it's coming out, or series of flower buds. I don't know what they call this. I'm not a botanist, so I don't know. But we see them kind of all gathered up here in the middle, around one side, on the left side. They're not quite, sprouting outwards or jetting out, and then we see it starting to come out sometime later. They're lengthening out and the buds are almost ready to come out. And then we see on this like another variety of white Camas, not death Camas, but white Camas, the early buds on the bottom erupting. And see, this one is already at the second layer. The bottom layer has already done, and they're turning to seed. And the upper layers have yet to come out. And sometime later, we see like on the right side, we see them continuing moving upwards. So it's a really interesting plant. It doesn't have one cycle; it has several weeks of cycles as it lengthens out as it gets taller. And then in June, the wetland returns again because we had a lot of water early in the or late spring, early summer this year, and so we see this. Then it's a very common cycle in areas where there's not a lot of drain fields. A lot of ditches have been built to drain off the lands to make more agricultural lands for farming. And we see at the height of the summer, then the camas, the giant camas you see is pretty far up. The common camas has already gone to seed. A number of these plants in the picture are on the bottom. The lower ones are at seed. But the giant camas is still going. You can see several of them are just not done yet. They've still got several layers of flowers to go. And they are at the tops of the grass. So they are topping the highest of the grasses in the fields, of the fescues and everything else in the field, which is really interesting to me. I think they're clearly in competition with the grasses and other plants for attention from the bees and other pollinators, and so they are just still going crazy in this field. And so here we are, even in late June, there's still a few left. The last buds are out, but they're still topping the grasses, sometimes by as much as a foot. This one in the middle, man, he's huge. Look how big that is, you know. And so they're still very prominent, even though the one in the foreground here, you can see, has all gone to seed. It's turned into the green seeds that you normally see previous to when they dry out and turn all dried and rattly. And then about this time, we start to see other plants taking over the fields. We start to see the mallows and daisies and other plants just coming out. And it kind of reminded me that maybe there's not just one summer season, or maybe there's all these micro seasons based on which plants are available, you know. It's not just summer. It's, well, there's the canvas summer, then there's the mallow summer, and then there's the thistle summer, and then there's the tarweed summer. And so you can just follow this along, and each main plant in the area has its time that it takes over. We start to see there's another mallow here. Here's wild onion, and here's your tarweed. And tarweed in certain areas just goes crazy and takes over. Smells really bad or good, depending on how you like it. And then it's very, very tarry, so the farmers hate it. They think it's actually a weed because it's got tarweed in its name. It's not. It's actually a native plant that people use for food. They would let it burn off, and then or burn it off intentionally, and then harvest the seeds, because once you burn it off, the sticky part goes away. But the farmers hate it because it would actually ruin the furs of the sheep and the cattle and stuff. And so they try to get rid of it. They try to eradicate it and call it a weed. It's not really a weed. It's just another plant. And then your camas, just before this time period, has gone to really sort of hard seeds. It's all dried up, these 3-chambered seed pods. And it's really quite interesting to walking through a field like of these dried out pods and listening to the camas seeds, you know, rattle. They have little rattly sounds, like walking through a field of these rattles. And so it's really hard to catch that sound on my phone. I've tried to. It's not easy, but it's kind of neat too. And then you realize that anything that walks along, they're a bird, a deer, a human, even the wind could probably make those seeds be cast out pretty broadly. So that's really interesting. I like sort of catching the whole life cycle of the camas, just to understand more about how it works. And then sometime in the fall, then we have a time period of burning the prairies, and we have several stories of this happening. But generally in September, when the weather turns a little bit more wetter, there's a lot more rainfall. It's a good time to sort of start burning the prairies. And that clears out a lot of excess vegetation, the old vegetation, the stuff that's gone brown, eliminates a lot of pests, creates cleared areas for deer and humans, because otherwise, if you don't do that in Oregon, we get like this massive bramble that you can't walk through or anything. So this is the most efficient way to sort of burn off, to sort of clear out the land. And it stimulates a lot of stuff. It stimulates a lot of growth of other plants. Some plants are dependent on, fire or heat to actually do something, to open seeds and stuff. And some plants like to eliminate their competitors, and when their competitors are eliminated like this, they do better next year. So, and anything with a root plant is going to survive really well, because clearly the roots are underground, the bulbs are underground, and so Camas does really well in this environment. That's pretty common. And this, again, going back to what I said earlier, this reminds me of these stories I was reading from the Wilkes expedition, the Henry L. Journal. And there's a couple journals that are not published yet, but I've gotten a hold of them from scholars that have given me copies. And they are not the Wilkes. They're not the same. There's not the same information as you see in the Charles Wilkes journals of the expedition. Charles Wilkes did not actually go down the valley past Salem, past Chemeketa at that time. He actually took the trip up the Columbia. So his lieutenants took the trip south down through the Willamette Valley into the Umpqua, through the Rogue River Valley and into California, finally to Sacramento. And so they recorded all of these really interesting situations in the lower valley. And one of them is this sort of low area they call La Mali, which is kind of a low wetland area that is not, we think it's not a French word, it's just a word in Kalapuyan that means wetland. It means like swaley wetland. But they recorded a lot of these things along the way, and it was right after a rainstorm. So, this was very common, and it makes me immediately think about, because I'm trying to, at some level, reconstruct the environment of what the Kalapuyans lived in before colonization, and it makes me think that maybe they were used to and adapted to living in a place that was wetlands a good part of the year. Because back then there was a lot more rain than there is today. So you can see that in a lot of the records. I mean, when I was a kid, there was a lot more rain than there was today. So things are absolutely changing. And so they knew to plan around the possibility of a rainstorm coming through the valley. And I think that's what they suggest in some of their journals here too, that the Kalapuyan mounds in some areas of the valley were adaptations to this wetland swale environment, because what would happen is women would a lot of times be sent out to harvest the camas, and so they knew that there would be a rainstorm. They'd be there for several weeks. They didn't want to pitch their tent or put their pit house in a place where it's going to become a flood the next morning. So they instead built up these sort of low hills that would be just above the floodwaters to pitch their camp on. And so that, I think that those hills were eventually used for other things. Perhaps, people lived on them, or perhaps you buried some important people in them. But I think that's, to me, makes sense. It's an adaptation to get above the floodwaters. And we see that in other areas of the world, like in Florida. We know that people would build up land masses in the Everglades to get above the watery situation in the Everglades. So it makes sense. So that's my spiel on that. So we have lots of areas of the valley that have mounds along the Long Tom River, along the Kalapuya River, into the Tangent area, and then there's actually traditions have been noticed as far up north as the Tualatin area, so in the Tualatin Valley. So it seems like a general adaptation of the Kalapuyans to this climate and environments. And the Wapato harvest is another thing. Wapato, again, is a massive crop. It grew in really kind of any kind of nice wetland, swamp, marshy environment, swale, slough. and today it grows in the Willamette Slough, which is on the other side of Salvia Island from the Columbia. It grows a lot on Salvia Island when it's allowed to by agriculturalists. It's actually the main plant, the main attraction for the Cascades people who lived at Cascade Locks or Cascade Rapids back in the day. They would move into what's now called the Portland Basin and set up their temporary villages along the riverside, mainly the South Bank, and they would harvest through the winter Wapato, not salmon, but Wapato. And so this is when I read this is a big surprise to me, because a lot of times we talk about the Chinooks and they're always attracted to salmon. And now it makes you think, well, maybe they had a lot more going on than just salmon. And so Wapato, for whatever reason, this valley grows a lot of Wapato, at least in the north part of the valley. And Wapato was a very nutritious plant, and people liked it. So basically, at the end of the wintertime, the Chinook people would pack up their whole villages, including their houses and everything, take them apart, and then put them in their canoes, and then canoe back up river, and then reset up their houses again where the original villages are. And so then they would be there in time for the spring Chinook run. And so this is a pretty consistent pattern that probably went on for thousands of years in this area. And certain areas like Salvia Island, people would just stay there because they had a pretty good crops of Wapato already. They were essentially located for trade. They had pretty good access to rivers in the area for salmon, like the Willamette and Willamette Falls. And so they didn't really have to go anywhere. They just stayed there pretty much. So, but the Cascades did as we moved. And so this is the northern area. And as we move, and here's like a more deeply marked up graphic of around Blue Lake in Portland. We see all of these wetlands areas on this map from the 1850s would have been subject to Wapato growing because they're wetlands, and we know that Wapato grew on the islands, and there's a big lake on this island over here, and there's all the banks of the Columbia were subject to tidal pressure, and were going up and down continually throughout the days. And so that would have been actually a good Wapato growing area, and the sloughs around them, and the rivers and the creeks and all that stuff would have all been good Wapato growing areas. And so, and Lewis and Clark came upon, when they came to these villages, they came upon scads of these little teeny canoes. They drew pictures of right here on top, and I call them Wapato canoes because they thought they were used mainly by women to gather Wapato. Because they're very small, one-person canoes, and could be easily handled by one person. So there you go. So that's interesting. This really interesting adaptation that we really haven't looked at very closely for Wapato in the area, and the good possibility that the whole of the Portland area was actually a Wapato growing area. That was what it was mainly there for. Other places were for salmon, but not this area. This was not a big salmon area. It was mainly for Wapato. So, so this is some oral histories of people drying up their foods in the summertime for winter storage, and talks about, salmon, how they would dry it for the winter, hazelnuts, acorns, tarweed seeds. Talked about how they prepared them, how they would dry them out and then rehydrate them in the wintertime in time for making food. Same thing with their berries. People used to dry their berries, put them in the paper, on some paper over a flat log, and their berries would become dry. So drying out berries and later on rehydrating them in soups and stews, or mixing them sometimes with salmon to make a form of what they call salmon ice cream, which was literally dried salmon mixed with dried berries and then rehydrated together. Sounds good? I don't know, but all right. Changes begin coming around 1830s. Colonization and fur trade is in effect, but the main change that caused, besides the economic change of trading for furs and new products coming in the market, the big thing that came along was malaria. Malaria changed really everything by destroying some 97% of some tribes, like the Kalapuyans, especially, were hit really hard with malaria. And so this radically changed things. Where there had been 10 villages, there were one of the survivors that went to these main villages to probably seek companionship and safety and in numbers among their own people. And many tribes disappeared altogether at this time period because they confederated together or combined together with other tribes. And this kind of a constriction down from many people, of thousands of people, upwards of 16,000 Kalapuyans, probably down to maybe 1,000 Kalapuyans altogether, would have caused openings to occur in their land. And that's why when in the 1830s, when the missionaries were coming along, settling the Willamette Valley at places like Willamette, French Prairie, and then advertising these changes to the people in the East, saying that there was all this open land, nobody was using it, it was seen to be cleared, and they wanted white people to come to Oregon, and they really kind of caused the whole Oregon Trail to happen by doing so. So this is what started the whole thing. Malaria really kind of set it all off, causing these openings to appear and causing great changes in the political dynamics of the tribes. Settlement came along, and we start a few hundred people at first, and then tens of thousands of people eventually took all the land, leaving nothing for the tribes. I mean, even a lot of their claims were on top of tribal villages, regardless of where the villages were. Tribal people were not allowed to settle, not allowed to claim their own land because they were not U.S. citizens. And this all occurred despite the fact that under U.S. land law, Native people were supposed to have their own title to their own land, and nothing had been yet sold. The land was still technically owned by them, and there had been no treaties, no war, and so nothing had occurred to actually give the land to the settlers in the first place. So some scholars have talked about this, about there being this sort of like just people ignored the law and just did what they wanted to do. And even, lawmakers ignored the law, and because nobody wanted to police the Americans, who basically just thought they had the right to take all the land without any kind of respect to the Native people that already lived there. But rapid settlement meant that there's a huge cultural change in the valley, where there had been lots of sort of native foods, wild foods. Those things were being hunted out by settlers. You had guns and are really efficient at hunting. And then the plants like Wapato and Camas and those kind of things were being at first eaten, and then later on were being plowed under because settlers wanted their own foods. They wanted their own European type foods and other foods they'd gotten from the Americas. And they began planting oats and wheat and barley and corn and vegetables and stuff, so they could have the foods they were used to. But this monocropping took away all the native plants, and so we see kind of a graphic of this in this image here. So I see a sort of native field with Camas being turned into basically a wheat field. This monocropping destroyed many environments for animals and plants, from insects and birds and everything, and tribes. And then so what was happening is tribes are losing food. All their food sources are being plowed under, and because settlers owned land and put up fences, they would not allow tribal people to actually go onto their land and harvest, unless there was some sort of understanding in effect. And sometimes there was. Sometimes some people did utilize the labor of the tribes, hired them on a daily basis to do something like make a fence or something, traded them for food or trade a horse for that, for whatever their labor was, or products they wanted, like, glass beads or a gun or metal, a knife, whatever it is. But generally what was happening is more and more of their food was plowed under, to the point that in the 1850s, it was determined by 1851 that all of the land in the valley was owned by settlers. There was no room for tribes, even if they wanted to have their own reservation land in the valley. And so, and the tribes at that point were actually being called vagrants and thieves. And I believe it's because, you know, when they had finished helping the settlers build their farms, there was not a lot of work for them after that. And so they tried to subsist on their own, and so their own sort of traditional ways, and it wasn't working because they were not able to get enough food to store for the wintertime. And so they're constantly running afoul of their sort of American neighbors. And so they at first there are actually records of them going to the farms and requesting, you know, food, asking for help, and being refused by the settlers, because settlers did not want to live, not want to help vagrants out, did not want to help people that were considered poor and thieves and savages, non-Christian savages. And so so what happened is people began starving, they began stealing for their survival, stealing cattle, stealing food, and so they were called thieves. And so at that point, I believe the Americans had taken over the valley, and so they decided they had to get rid of the tribes because they were just a pest, a pestilence on the land. And the two ways they could either get rid of them was either through genocide, which was actually proposed numerous times in the local papers, and actually was done in several cases in sort of Southern Oregon and Northern California. But the Indian agents in Oregon were a little more moral and ethical than that, and so they decided to find a way to save the tribes by putting them on reservations. And they decided on first the Coast Reservation, then the Grand Ronde Reservation for removal. So this is kind of that graphic that shows basically this sort of tribes labored for the settlers. They learned how to become farmers. They learned how to like manage domesticated animals. They began collecting even their own herds of cattle and horses too, because they knew that was kind of a political capital in the new culture of Oregon. But they were not allowed to have any land, and so eventually they were sort of crowded out of their own attempts to, I guess, become part of the new civilization, you know, and many of them lost all their property, lost whatever they had collected over the years, because they didn't have any real rights in American society. If they had a lawsuit, if they had a claim against the white people for whatever, for stealing, for sometimes for theft from them, sometimes for raping their women, sometimes for murder, the courts would not hear any cases from the tribes because tribal people normally do not speak English, and the courts the judges could easily deny any kind of witnesses to a crime that didn't speak English. So that was kind of unfortunate. So that's why the Indian agents decided to put them on reservations to sort of stop all the bloodshed, stop the conflict, and to manage them in a different way, and hopefully to save them. So there were a number of treaties written. The ones from 1853 to 55 were finally ratified. These treaties set up an exchange of land to the United States in exchange for permanent reservations, food, services like education and healthcare, and even a situation of safety. They could actually live safer on the reservation than they could in their own lands. And they sold it to the tribes like that too. They said that, you know, you'd be better off if you moved to the reservation because you'd be no longer subject to being attacked by whites. And so that was literally a way to get the tribes off their land onto the reservation, because for whatever reason, it was probably politically difficult, but the American government would not police its own people, would not do anything against their own white people that were taking land from tribes, attacking them, murdering them, raping them, doing whatever they could to get their land, taking away all the resources. They would not do anything about that. So here's the first picture of the map of the Grand Ronde Indian Reservation. Most of the people were put in the Central Valley. The valley in the red here was the area where the Rogue River and Umpqua people were placed, and they were eventually, many of them were actually taken to the Siletz Reservation. But the people that were Kalapuyan pretty much stayed at Grand Ronde. There was no recorded removals to Siletz. There was some marriage in, but pretty much they just stayed here. The tribes are moved to this area in 1855. By April of 1855, the whole valley of Indians had been moved on to Grand Ronde Reservation. The Lucky Mutes had to walk the trail to Grand Ronde, and I believe it was along with the Santiams in the area as well. And they came, the train came through, not train, but the walking path came through Albany, and then they may have taken the riverboat up a little ways, and then they walked overland to probably down the Applegate Trail to eventually to Grand Ronde. A lot of people went through Rickerall at that point, but they found that Rickerall was not really happy to see Native peoples, were kind of angry people, and so they sometimes they bypassed Rickerall and went up other ways through PD and stuff. So they ended up going to Grand Ronde and settling at the reservation along with the other Kalapuya people. And the whole valley was removed in a series of hubs. The Southern Valley was the people on the east side of the Southern Valley, like Springfield area, Cottage River, moved up to let's see, the ferry, the Spores Ferry area became a hub, and from there they caught a riverboat all the way to Corvallis, and Corvallis then became the secondary hub where they collected everybody from the South Valley, and from there they all got in the riverboat, and then they traveled up to Dayton, and then from Dayton they traveled overland to Grand Ronde. Very roundabout way, but it was kind of a safer way to move the tribes through the valley, because there was still a lot of people in the valley did not like tribes at all, wanted to commit violence on them, and if you keep them all in the riverboat, then people are less likely to be able to get access to them. So that's what's been kind of explained to me, and it makes sense. Otherwise, I think it's a little faster to walk overland just to Grand Ronde, but that's what they did. So so that whole process was begun in really kind of March 1855. They put people on temporary reservations, and then the one at the Lucky Mute were placed on the reservation at Comegi's farm. I've never really found that yet. So there, Comegi was a guy who was kind of a character. He had hogs, and so there's a pretty funny letter from him complaining that the Kalapuyans in the area had hunting dogs, and the dogs were chasing his hogs around. And so I always thought that was kind of funny. But and so he was complaining about that, and he wanted to get rid of it, but he also was placed in charge of them because apparently the Kalapuyans village was right next to his property. So so that was pretty interesting. But there weren't a lot of Lucky Mutes, probably about, I think there's 22 or so Lucky Mutes remaining at the time of removal. So those people end up on the reservation along with the other tribes. The most of any of the Kalapuyas, I think, was the Santiam, and they had I think a couple hundred people. But most of the Kalapuya bands were in the 20s, literally. So on the reservation, the tribes were submitted to this U.S. assimilation policy, which had three kind of legs to it. One was tribes were exposed to farming; they had to become farmers, especially the adults. They were supposed to, but the funny thing was they were supposed to become farmers, and that was part of the treaty. But they were not given the tools, the seed, and the land in Grand Ronde was very bad. I don't know if you know about the soil in Grand Ronde, but much of the valley is just clay. So, and the water sources are very bad. So they didn't have really the resources. And then for literally 20 years, they were not given any land. And so I don't know how you expect them to actually become farmers at that point. But they did finally get that going in the 1870s. And within 10 years, if you look through the federal Indian reports, those the people at Grand Ronde were called self-sufficient because I think they had learned they could not depend on the government for anything. So once they were given a little bit of rights, their sawmill was rebuilt, the grist mill was rebuilt. They were given a few tools. They were able to sort of make it on their own and learn how to operate everything on their own. And so they were doing well by the 1880s. The second way was through education. A lot of the native kids are placed into schools. At first, the schools were very badly managed. For whatever reason, the Methodist schools were very badly managed, but the Catholic schools are really well managed because I know the Catholics had a national organization, and so they really were pushing for Catholic education on all the reservations. They wanted contracts literally with the United States for that. But education was kind of haphazard into the 1860s. It looks like it got a little more organized. We started to see some actually scholars develop, people that could read and were somewhat intelligent. They could tell they were intelligent. There's some reports about some boys that were very intelligent. And then it isn't until the 1870s we see Catholic education take off and a boarding school actually occur at the reservation. By 1878, we have the Catholic boarding school there, and that's called originally it was just called the Grand Ronde School. And the girls were made to stay at the boarding school. The boys could come and go because they were seen to be more useful on the farms than the girls. So, and then eventually they did actually build a boys' dormitory, so they actually stayed there as well. But that school kept on going into the 1950s. So that's, and then later on, to find ways to save money, the U.S. government began what they call off-reservation boarding schools. And the off-reservation schools were meant to concentrate a lot of Native students in one school rather than having a number of small schools. And that way they could centralize their education, keep it more consistent. They could hire their own teachers rather than have the churches run them, and they hopefully would save costs. It was also seen to be better to move the kids off the reservation and pretty far away from the reservation so they could not escape and go home. So they were kept in the school sometimes for 9 months to a year before they were allowed to return home, literally immersing them in American culture so that they stopped talking Indian, they stopped believing the ways of their tribes. And all education at that time was all Christian education, because that's where the teachers got their education from, mainly from religious organizations that had education in cities and stuff like that. So anyway, so that's the other way. And then the last way was just by opposing missionaries on the reservation, starting a church and then making that a mandated activity in the United States. So here's agricultural, that was seen as the ideal American lifestyle. That was the way, that was one of the ways that was picked to actually civilize the tribes. Unless you were considered civilized, people didn't think you should become an American. And so that was held over Native people's heads for some 50 years, saying until you become civilized, you can't become an American and become equal with us. So you need to become Christian, you need to become educated, you need to become a farmer in order to be a true American. So a lot of people went that direction. They tried really hard, but most people died without getting any kind of rights at all, not getting their due. And that was mentioned in their treaties. It took their kids and grandkids to actually make it to 1824 when the American Indian Citizenship Act was passed. So I don't know if you can do this again. Basically, this is a recap. They're reinscribing the land with a new culture. All the farmers did this, and then replaced the tribes, and then changed everything, food systems, and native plant systems, and made it impossible for native people to actually practice our culture in their traditional way. So they had to move to reservations to survive, and there at the reservations they were made to be somewhat farmers, which was not ever a thing in Oregon previously. And then, so the last thing I want to bring up is this draining wetlands. This last year, I began doing a little bit of research on Wapato Lake and Lake Labiche outside of Salem. And I grew up in Salem, so I always wondered how Lake Labiche became so dry. Why was it all ag land? And then I did some research and found out by 1918, a family of land investors had bought 1,000 acres along Lake Labiche. At that time, it was a big swamp, a marsh, and it was being slowly drained, or they wanted to drain it, but they didn't have the money. And so what they did is they attracted this investor to buy 1,000 acres. He bought a ditch witch, a drainer, to drain off the land. They built a 6-mile ditch from Lake Labiche to the Willamette, which is now I think it's Lake Labiche Creek. It goes through Kaiser, Oregon, and they built a system of dikes and ditches so they could actually regularly drain off the lake. So by 1918, he did this. He then turned around and sold all of his land for a premium, so he made tons of money on it. It's the same family that built, I think, Hayesville, which is east part of Salem, northeast Salem. I believe he took the profits from the lake land sales and bought a bunch of land northeast Salem and made that a huge subdivision. But anyway, so what that did is that destroyed all of the native food sources that were in the lake, and we didn't know how much food was in the lake. And so recently I actually was invited to revisit the lake, and I was suspecting that there's Wapato there, like had been at Wapato Lake. Here's an image of Wapato Lake before it also was drained by 1936 in the same way, 35 in the same way. And so it had massive amounts of Wapato. It had also millions and millions of canvasback ducks that used to visit there, which don't exist anymore. Apparently they don't come to Oregon anymore because it's not the lake anymore. But Lake Labiche was this big long lake, and we didn't know much about it. I didn't know much about it, what it was like before. But it turns out that when I was invited, this farmer there, that he had been restoring a nature preserve there for some 20 years. Basically, his restoration involved basically just not plowing anymore and allowing the water to come back, and this is a Wapato patch now. He's got 4 of these Wapato patches there that have returned, and he didn't plant them. They just came back after some 100 years of being destroyed, being plowed under. And then, and this is what Lake Labiche looks like today, where it's mostly these red onion fields. As you know, the soils are really dark, really black, really peat mossy soils. Here's another picture of that after they've been harvested. They're actually red onions. And then this is just a few weeks ago. We see the Wapato is starting to go. It's the time to harvest them. And we dug down. We found some pretty good Wapatos. I don't know if this is an ideal climate because they're not really huge, but there is Wapato there. This is this one shovelful. We got something like 8 or 9 Wapato with that one shovelful. And I guess if there was more of a wetland environment, they may get bigger. Right now, there are some. I mean, the water was only about a foot, like a half foot down, so it came in as soon as you start digging. So the water table is really kind of high. So I'll bet you if we allow this area to go back into a marshland all the time, these would grow much larger. So there's been a lot of changes to the land. It's really difficult to restore, understand Kalapuya culture, and how to sort of restore Kalapuya culture as best as we can. How do we decolonize the area without understanding what it was like before? And so what I've been doing is trying to relearn what things were like before, understand where the resources were. I don't even know if there was Wapato past Salem. you know, in the Southern Valley. I have no records of that at all. And I'd like to do more research on, you know, areas that have been drained off to create more arid ag lands in the Southern Valley to see if there was Wapato in the South, because, you know, a recent project down there that listed off a bunch of native plants did not list Wapato as a plant in the Eugene area. So I'm very concerned. I'm wondering how far south it went. Is there a Wapato belt? I don't know. So so I don't need to read all these things off, but just I just wanted to show those few things about the Kalapuyans in our area, give you a little bit of history and some clues about where I'm going with all this stuff. And I guess I'm available for questions. I've probably gone long, but you know.
No worries, David. Thank you so much. And we do have some questions, and I'm going to let Kendra take over for that portion.
Sure. Okay. Well, our first one came in pretty early, and it was about the 12-month calendar that you showed, and they were just wondering if the Gachette, the person who wrote the calendar, imposed that 12-month thing, or was that part of the traditional calendar?
Well, I mean, if you look at the, you didn't get a chance to read the whole preamble to the thing, but it says they originally had a 6-month calendar, and then later on they adopted a 12-month calendar. They're probably like influenced by settlers, because settlers came in with a Gregorian 12-month calendar. So, but they had them all labeled off pretty well, and so they clearly went through some planning to figure out what month was what, and the calendar didn't match exactly the same time periods as we have for our calendar for different months and things. It actually begins in at the end of summer. So it doesn't begin in January like our January. So I think it was influenced clearly by settlers. Gachette had no role in that, as far as I could tell. I mean, he may have had some role in translation, but I think it's been retranslated by other scholars since that time, and they say he's pretty right on. So yeah, so that's what I know about that.
Great. All right. And is there a reason that you know of that the Kalapuyans did not fish?
I didn't say didn't fish. I mean, we do have a pretty good story. It's the only one I know of this man named Chief Halo, who was from the Yoncalla, and he set up a fishing weir on the Row River outside of Cottage Grove, and there's a story of him sharing that with a white man that owned the land, and they would take turns clearing it out each day, and the white man would give him all the eels, and so because he liked the eels, and so I think they absolutely did fish. They would get freshwater mussels, they would get trout and salmon as they could, they would get eels. The problem is there isn't a really good riffles or rapids or a waterfall like you see at Willamette Falls, where you can easily catch the fish. I mean, otherwise you have to set up like weirs and traps, and you have to maybe gill netting, and there was, and I don't know if they had gill nets for the Kalapuyans. So you know, you can't really see the fish. So it's much easier to get the fish if you can see them jumping out of the water, clearly.
Right. Okay. Another question about food. Why do you think European settlers didn't adopt more of the native foods, similar to like when they adopted corn? You know,
the native foods were not agricultural foods. You know, so you couldn't necessarily depend on them like you could agriculture. And agriculture, and actually the Europeans were very much capitalist. They were selling the food not to other people living in Oregon, but most of the products they made, like in French Prairie and other places, was shipped out to places like San Francisco or someplace, Seattle or wherever. And so even to China and stuff. So yeah, I mean, it was a investment for them. They were trying to make money on this stuff, and then they ate some of it too. So yeah, so, but I mean, I think some native foods were adopted. I think that there are some hints that like the Chinese that came here later on that were part of the building the railroads and dams and stuff, they actually adopted using Wapato a lot. That things like blackberries and strawberries and berries were well liked. And if you talk about native foods, you have to talk about salmon and elk and deer. Clearly, those were liked by the settlers. It's just that they, you can't farm Camas like you would farm potatoes. That's all.
Right. The Wapato field I thought was pretty impressive though. It looked like an agricultural field. Okay, the next one I have, this person says, is a very interesting talk. Do you have recommendations for a book or other resources to learn more about what the Willamette Valley looked like and how it functioned, like plants, animals, hydrology, etc., before settlers arrived?
And that's a good question. I don't know. I mean, there are a few botanical sources. There are a few studies here and there. Many of them are pretty old, maybe a century old and stuff. There are a few more recent ones that are more academic. I don't know. I mean, there are some histories out there that do talk about some things. Like there's a recent history of the North Santiam area that has some native history in it too. I'm actually writing one book myself. The manuscript is in press right now, so it may be out next year sometime. But yeah, there's not a lot. I mean, there are some like town histories and area histories that there isn't a lot like putting together what the environment was like, environmental histories, so to speak,
So is there much in their oral histories that you've read that explains what it was like?
No, I mean, I think the best I found for that is the newspapers. If you go to historic newspaper database online from U of O and search through the early Oregon newspapers, the Oregonian and the Statesman Journal and those folks, there are these descriptions of the valley in the newspapers. People would sometimes travel onto the coast or travel to the inland or travel down a valley, and they would write a record of their travels, and sometimes that was very descriptive, But you don't find a lot. I mean, the explorers accounts that we see that are the best are, Wilkes expedition journals are pretty good. But if you can get the originals, those are hard to find. I mean, the Wilkes journals themselves are okay for some of that. David Douglas manuscripts are good. There's Jack Nesbitt had done a good job on writing up some of that stuff. So some of the early records like that are pretty interesting.
Cool.
David, would you mind if I posted the link to your page, the Indian history?
Oh yeah, my site would be a good place to check.
I think that's a pretty great site. Yeah, I'm going to put it in the chat.
What about your site? Yeah, I mean, I think mine's becoming pretty good now. I think that it's irregular and not well put together sometimes, but you can find stuff on there if you do searches and stuff. So
I think you have.
I didn't create it in order, so it's a lot of like my own interests and stuff. So that doesn't really help, I guess. But
I found it to be fascinating and very helpful. Yeah.
Great. Another question is, how are tribes involved with the state archaeologist? For example, if someone finds a cultural resource like an arrowhead, like an obsidian projectile points or anything like that on their private property, how does that work?
Well, I think under Oregon and federal law, there's nobody telling you what to do on your private property. I think it is illegal to dig up burials and burial goods anywhere, but a lot of times private property, nobody's going to know really. If you're next to a navigable waterway and you find stuff, that's actually part of the law. You can't really dig that up, and you're not supposed to even look for it. And generally, there is a state archaeologist, but normally you would contact the SHPO office, the State Historic Preservation Office, as part of state parks in Salem. That's one way, or you could just contact the tribes directly if you have stuff.
Okay.
I mean, arrowheads are pretty commonly found, and there's people that have old farms in the area that have like buckets full of arrowheads because they've dug up over the years. And there's so much that a lot of times we just don't know what to do with it all. But you can gift it to the tribes if you can go there and give it to them and stuff. So
good. Okay, thank you. Did the Kalapuya harvest lamprey? I believe you said maybe a little bit about that. And then if so, what season would they harvest them?
Well, when they run, and I'm not quite, I haven't really harvested lamprey myself, but whenever the lamprey run, they spawn just like salmon, maybe not just like salmon, but
Yeah.
at the same time, at the same way as salmon, they kind of climb up over the falls in their weird way and then come down the rivers and spawn in the sandy soils just like salmon do. They're not, I guess they're not really an eel. They're some other kind of fish, but technically they're not really an eel. That's why I never call them, I try to never call them eels, even though I probably do once in a while. But but yeah, I mean, they're and the Willamette Valley has one of the only healthy crops of them, or populations of them anymore. That's why a lot of tribes are very interested in studying them at Willamette Falls, because most of the other areas that has falls and rapids and stuff have been destroyed by dams. So we have the only extant healthy population still. I think that the Kalapuyas absolutely liked lamprey. They could trade for it at the falls if they wanted to. It was also a fish that you could dry up that preserved really well, and so and they would get it themselves when they could. In the the Chief Halo story suggests that people could actually absolutely set up traps for the eels. They're probably harder to trap, but they could absolutely do that, and so they probably did occasionally, but it wasn't as easy a job. From what I could tell, the Kalapuyans were not typical what we think is typical hunters, where they're going out and searching for deer. They pretty much would snare or trick the deer or fish into some kind of a trap, and then get them. But they wouldn't spend like tons of hours tramping through the wilderness finding deer. They would just outthink the deer and outthink the elk and outthink the fish, by using traps.
Very interesting. Okay, do you have an idea of how much Camas habitat is left today compared to what was there to begin with?
Probably 1% or less than what it was originally like. Yeah, I would say.
Okay.
I mean, I wouldn't know. I mean, I haven't tried to quantify it.
Okay.
There's 3 major fields in the Salem area. In most areas, there's at least one field left. It's usually a field that hasn't been plowed in a very long time. So,
Well, before we continue, I just want to be aware that it is 8 o'clock. And David, I know before the presentation, you said you would be willing to answer questions for a bit of time after the 8 o'clock. Would that? Okay, great.
Okay, I have one question that's really just a thank you very much. So thank you, lots of great information. We really appreciate
it.
That's an easy one to answer. Great. And then is there any evidence that beaver or beaver habitats, wetlands, featured prominently in Kalapuya tradition, culture, environment?
We do have stories of beaver. I don't think, and I think that most people don't think, that the Kalapuyans hunted beavers, but there was a lot of beaver here, like a lot of beaver in the area, and they probably helped create much of the wetland character of the valley. There's a pretty good book that I just picked up. I'm just going to try to read. It's called Beaver, Bison, Horse. It really kind of talks about these animals as helping create environments. I mean, it's more about the plains, but I think some of the lessons apply here. But yeah, I think that beaver only became really important as a resource with the fur trade. So I don't see. I'm in actually a conversation with some scholars about this. They don't think that even during the fur trade, the tribes would go after the beavers themselves, because the tribes respected the beavers too much. Lots of stories in the area of beavers being these kind of on par with coyote as a symbol. He would actually fight coyote a lot, and in some of the tribes in the area have stories about how the beaver fight with coyote when beaver was torn apart because he lost the battle. the tribes came from the beaver. So
Very interesting. All right, the next one, are local, state, federal government and Oregon State University, for example, going to start using more indigenous practices in a way to try to fight climate change, fires, drought, those sort of things?
well, we can all hope that's true. I mean, I had discussions today with some people in forestry about that. In my class today, we were talking about that, and I think everybody was kind of the opinion that, you know, while this is happening, we see it happening in California. There's been this sort of change towards people's attitudes towards accepting cultural fire as a way to sort of help manage the fire situation in California. And there's been some laws that have changed because of that this last year. We don't see the same thing happening in Oregon. There's talk about it, but it's not really happening. And I think it's because, you know, the timber industry has a huge influence in Oregon. They own a lot of land. Timber is still a big crop in Oregon. Timber companies have yet to accept this idea of cultural use of fire to help manage these crops, and still believe it's going to destroy the timber. And so until we see some changes in forestry policy, we're not really going to see indigenous practices come in as regular policy. And so I don't know. I mean, it's just a matter. I think it relies a lot about what things that you guys do. I mean, it's not just us, but everybody. If you see that as a valuable thing, like you want, you know, Native people at the table because they know something that could perhaps save the environment or save the world around you from burning down to the ground, maybe you could talk to people about keeping us at the table when we're having these discussions about droughts and fire and climate change and everything else, because, you know, tribal people are fully willing to engage in these discussions, but we're a lot of times not even invited to the table. So you know, it's just not a factor because we're a very small part of the whole.
What is one of your biggest questions that you haven't found the answer to as you've been just studying the Valley's history?
I don't know. I think I still kind of key off that issue of why the land was taken and why the United States government did nothing to stop its own people from violating their own laws. And I think that's going to go on for some time. I think that there's that's where this idea that there needs to be some sort of reciprocity comes from, is this idea that, hey, you know, the federal government should have taken more control of its people. The Americans, you know, were not willing to follow law, or willing to sort of destroy Native people to sort of seek their own wealth and their own future. Native people now today, most of us do not have any long-term wealth. There are no Native people with 100-year farms in Oregon or anywhere else in the West, I would gather, because we were not allowed to own land 100 years ago. So just thinking about that, I mean, people think, well, you guys are just crying because it's, you know, you've lost. I'm like, well, yeah, and maybe it's because the whole rules of the game were stacked against us. You know, there was no equality, there's no equity there at all in the laws. And if we had been given the right to, like everybody else, own land, own resources, have property, like all the other Americans, then I think we would be in a different situation today. So, you know, these are just one of these situations that it's hard to get over it. I mean, because this is my family, you know, my family is still in the situation. We do not have any long-term wealth in our family. Not that I'm asking for a handout of a bunch of money. I just want people to realize that that is part of the settler legacy. Right. You know, the settlers set up these laws, set up these rules, and you know, unbalance or rig the game essentially against us, and now we're living through that right now. So
right. What have you learned from your research about the different species of deer and elk that were here before white settlement?
I think the whitetails are gone. Used to be a lot more whitetail deer here.
Mhm.
They're probably too easy to see by hunters, you know, because of the whitetails. But so yeah, I think black-tailed deer is the most common nowadays, but there used to be a ton of whitetail. They're the most common in this area. Elk, there, I mean, yeah, I mean, there used to be a ton of elk in the valley. There was so much elk in this valley, it attracted tribes from pretty far away to come here. Like Chemeketa and Klamath people would actually come and hang out and camp in the valley for the whole summer hunting elk. And they did this like every year. So there was lots of elk in this valley, in this area of Oregon, and we don't have the same today. So it's just a remnant of that in the valley.
Right, this is a pretty specific one. Have you met Douglas Tallamy, author of Nature's Best Hope? Because he's a New York Times bestseller and would be great pairing to promote Native Indian American causes too. And this person goes on to say it's terrible what was done in the past, and it seems reparations and much more needs to be done.
I don't know who Douglas Tallamy is. We have our own sort of authors and people, our own thinkers that we work with. I think most Native people would rather work with Native people who, you know, because a lot of times there's a huge lift, and the lift is teaching people to respect our point of view. And so respect our history, to understand our history. And so we'd rather work with people you don't have to do that basic education with first. And so I don't know who Douglas Tallamy is. Maybe he's in on all this stuff. He already knows everything, but I don't know. I guess I'm just saying that we would rather probably work with Native people.
All right. Do you give talks and walking tours of the areas that you've shared with us tonight that you discussed?
I don't do a lot of walking tours. I don't know. They're too much like a wine and flower tour. I just don't do that kind of thing. I do give a lot of talks, quite a bit of talks like this on Kalapuyans and other similar subjects. I've been doing some on the Takelma people, on the Umpqua people, on the coastal peoples, because I'm more broad in my research than just Kalapuya, even though Kalapuya is my most well studied subject. You know, a lot of times we are still studying these areas. You know, it's like, you know, I talk about Wapato Lake and Lake Labiche and the Camas fields and stuff. We're just in the middle of relearning this stuff, because I mean, I'm part of that assimilation. We were assimilated away from, my family never did learn this stuff. My dad didn't know the stuff I know. And so we are just in the midst of learning this stuff. I'm not experts at any means at all. So
this person would like to know, as a white settler, what would be the best practice for assisting and supporting Native people to bring back their foodways?
well, I think that you know, one of the, I've been asked this question quite a bit. You know, a lot of people ask us, what can we do? We want to help. Well, you know, there are organizations that are helping, like some of the watershed councils are helping quite a bit, doing active work on the ground. I've seen some pretty good efforts on the South Valley, like with Long Tom Watershed Council, the Willamette Stewardship Network, things like that have been doing pretty good work. And a lot of it, the work is, you know, learning the lessons, like that lift I just talked about, learning those early lessons about how to respect Native perspective and opinion, and how to incorporate that in the way you think about the land, not just think about the land as a commodity and a resource to be sort of made money from and stuff. And so a lot of people have to sort of unlearn a lot of the lessons of the past that they've learned from school or wherever. And so, but probably the best thing people could do is helping promote and sponsor sort of education as much as possible, like this. This is more like community education, but like for just public schools. And, you know, for right now, we're having a hard time. I mean, I have a hard time every every year that I start school, I have to start with the basics again with the same students. Another crop of students comes through. I have to tell them the very basics. I have to address the stereotypes. I have to address all that stuff from the very beginning, and build up a level of knowledge from that. And I would rather start at a higher level and then move it higher than that. And so I would like people to start supporting that our education systems begin teaching kids a little bit about Native people outside the stereotypes. There's actually a policy in place. There's actually curriculum out there. It's been developed, and if our school districts can begin adopting these things, we could then start in college at a higher level of discussion and maybe get to the next level sooner. I would just like to see that happen, and I think that it's going to have a huge effect, positive effect overall in our communities, because as people learn more about Native peoples, we start to feel more respected in our opinions and what we do. We're no longer sort of these symbols of the dying savage from the plains. We become symbols of people of this place. You know, we have understanding of this land. We have understandings of a different understanding of philosophy of how to live with this place rather than just destroying it. You know, and so there's all that there. I mean, there's a lot more to be said about this, but you know, there's lots of things people can do in that regard.
Thank you. Suzanne, I just want to clarify, I keep getting more questions, but
Yeah.
do you want to keep going? I mean, I'm happy to do that.
I'm okay. I'm okay for until about 8:30. I'm fine.
Okay.
Then we'll cut it off.
All right.
Okay.
I think we can probably get
through. Okay. I just want to make sure. The next one, what does land back mean to you, and how can we support that movement?
Well, land back is a movement that's trying to do some of that return, that reciprocity that I talked about. This idea that tribes were taken, their lands are taken away kind of illegally, and they never have had an opportunity to regain any land in any kind of, because really, among tribes, the land is how we practice our culture. I mean, we are part of the land, and we see ourselves as integral parts of this place. And there's some places in the world where like the Ohlone tribes in the Bay Area, they can't afford the land in the Bay Area. It's way too expensive. So if they got some bunch of land back, they could actually practice their culture there in their original tribal place. You know, tribes in Oregon don't need a lot of land back right now. We have a lot of land. It'd be nice if we had a few more parcels that we could actually practice all of our culture. Like Grand Ronde doesn't have any land on the Columbia, doesn't have any land in the Rogue River Basin or something like that. So it'd be nice if we had some parcels so members can go down there and visit and camp and maybe experience the land of their ancestors and stuff and learn some culture. Warm Springs has tons of land. Umatilla has tons of land. But majority of tribes just don't have enough land to practice their culture, and that's what we really need. I mean, if I want to go dig Camas, where do I go? I mean, I'm not allowed to dig in the city parks. I can't go dig in the Willamette National Forest unless I do it illegally. So I have to get a permit. So there's all these layers of bureaucracy between me and the resource. What if we were just allowed to go do that? So that's part of the problem. It's just that we just don't have access to land. It'd be nice if we had free access to land.
Sure. Thank you. As the next one is, as a timber landowner, we use fire every year to manage fuels. I don't know about the statement that the industry isn't in favor of fire. Most foresters are eager to see fuel management on private and public lands. So.
Well, I don't know if that's true. I mean, you're saying it. I don't know. I've been talking to various timber groups, fire groups, and they do have a problem with federal and state guidelines on fire right now. And many of these councils that are managing the policies are actually ran by former timber executives. So I don't know if that's true or not. There may be certain areas where fire is more accepted. I think Medford, people have stood up and said we want to try out some experiments with fire. I just don't know. I'd like to see some evidence of that before I said, okay.
Okay, and she followed up. She just said, can you clarify your statement about private forest land owners and fire? We're pretty eager about it, about fuels management on our own lands and public lands too. So.
Well, that's great. I mean, there are clearly people out there that do like that, but there are some laws in the state of Oregon that stop that happening on all lands. So we need to, think about that stuff.
I'm curious, what was the perspective of Kalapuyan people about various disabilities back then? Does that perspective survive to this day?
I don't, clearly I don't know the mind of people 150 to 200 years ago. Some tribes would destroy people that had disabilities, so they were not considered viable humans. Some people saw them as gifted entities. So it's just a matter of which tribe you're talking to. I've not read anything about the Kalapuyans about disabilities. Besides, some of the Kalapuyans had a blind eye. That's all I know, and I don't know what that means. But apparently there was a lot of eye disease in Oregon for whatever reason. Mm-hmm. So I can't even answer that question really. Sorry.
Okay. Back to Douglas Tallamy again. They said he's going to give a Zoom presentation to the Corvallis Evening Garden Club. I think he'd be fascinated to hear about you and your presentation. I'll ask him if he has any interest in learning more about you and what your goals are about. But I understand, they also say, I understand you want your own culture to speak for itself and to teach settling culture what it needs to hear. So I mean,
everybody's invited to presentations as I give them, so if he wants to, he could probably find a presentation at some point in the future.
Yeah, and this one will be recorded, so he could watch this one as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, great. I need some clarification. I'm to the last question.
Sorry, I went ahead. This question was they wanted the name of the journal that you write, and so I put in the directly to the Indian History Research.com.
Yeah, I originally called it Indian History Research Indian, and I now call it Cortex Journal. So Cortex was a mythical wolf of the southern Kalapuyas that was very tricky. So.
Awesome. Yeah, and I can say that we the Lucky Butte Watershed Council did add in, this is last year was the year that we celebrated our 20th anniversary of the council, and so the theme for that year and this year was the history of our watershed council and the history of the greater watershed, which we are a tiny small part. We're just babies, and when we consider the long millennia time immemorial where people have stewarded this watershed, so we added in a page on our website to talk about that history that went way before any of us, we're here, and so I got a lot of help and inspiration from that Cortex journal from your website. So thank you. So
yeah, I've got a couple things on there about Lucky Butte area, the tribes in that area. There's not a lot. Again, it's a rare thing because there wasn't it was like 22 people. So I don't know. I'm not going to make a lot of history that way. But I was going to say I like your shirt. Can I buy one?
Absolutely, cool. Yeah.
I'm always buying. I'm buying things like coffee mugs and shirts that have native names on them. So. I like the Takelma Coffee Company because they're owned by the Cop Creek tribe, but it has the word Takelma, so I bought their coffee cups and their shirts and stuff for that reason.
Yeah,
they say we'll send you one. Just give us your size. You don't have to buy
exactly.
One.
Yeah.
Do the stock for us.
So if anyone else, if you want to know what you can do for me, is that.
You got it. Just we'll talk after about size and color preference. So but yeah, if anyone else would like to get one of these shirts, you can go to our website, luckybuttelwc.org, And on the top is the link to the store, and you'll find them there. So, yeah. Well, David, I have to say I'm just thrilled that you were able to join us today. And we asked you a long time ago if you could do a presentation, and it finally worked out when you were able to fit that in. And I'm very appreciative and thankful for that. So.
Well, it's good to survive, the pandemic and be able to come out the other end with something positive. That's good. So.
Absolutely. And thank you to all of you who are still with us. I know it went longer than we said it would, but who could have stopped the wonderful questions and all the good information being presented. So once again, thank you so much. And if you all want to look at what's coming up next in our Citizen Science schedule, you can head to our website there in the chat. And I look forward to seeing you, or seeing your presence again at a future Citizen Science. Thank you all, everybody. And
Bye.
good night.